Learning to use equalization, also known as EQ, is the first step towards developing great mixing skills. Knowing how frequencies interact and knowing how they all fit together is a crucial skill that engineers such as yourself should have. EQ is the most important mixing processor to help achieve separation between all of your various tracks in your mix. So your drums, your bass, your guitars, your synths, your vocals, making sure that they all have a place in your mix, but that they also connect together frequency-wise. Throughout this series, you'll learn how EQ can help you in any audio situation, whether you're doing live sound or you're recording your own music in your home studio. You've used EQ many times before in your life, on your car stereo system, your home stereo system, or if you have a guitar amp. The bass, mid, and treble controls are effectively a 3-band EQ. Today you might be having trouble getting clearer mixes, so for example, getting your distorted guitars to really stand out of a dense mix, or to really get your hip-hop drums to jump out of the speakers. Or maybe your vocal sounds like it's muffled underneath all the other instruments in your mix that already sound like there's a blanket on top of them. After going through this series, you'll be able to make any instrument jump out of the speaker and have your mixes sound larger than life to have maximum impact on the listener. EQ does not have to be a mystery, so let me show you how to master it. Once you've learned how EQ works and how to address problem areas in your mixes will skyrocket. Hey yo, it's Alex from Audio Issues, and we're gonna go ahead and continue to talk about what EQ does and why it's so important. So I've pulled up Ableton with this session that I've been working on, and we're going to talk a little bit about what EQ is. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the Audio Issues EQ and slap it on the master bus of our mix. So all of our tracks are going to be going through this, and just for demonstration purposes. And if you haven't checked out the Audio Issues EQ, definitely check it out in the description below. It's a super handy tool that has all of the audio jargon and the language we use to describe frequencies. It's a super useful tool. So if we look at this thing as a mixing processor, equalization is one of the most important ones to create separation in your instruments and balance your mixes. You can think of it like a sculptor using a chisel. My dad's actually an amazing sculptor, and this analogy is totally synonymous with what we do with EQ. So you have a block of marble and you're chiseling away until something beautiful forms from your imagination. It's kind of the same thing with EQ. We're kind of finding the parts within various instruments that we want to accentuate frequency-wise, but also identifying any kind of resonant peaks or things that don't really work with the rest of the instruments in our mix, and we're surgically removing those with the EQ. When you use filters and cuts, you carve away at the frequency spectrum of your instruments, making room for everything in the mix and cutting away everything that doesn't belong. Because in most cases, in most mixes that you'll work on, you're gonna have too much frequency information, meaning that you're gonna have overlapping frequencies that are masking each other. You might have guitars, you might have drums, overheads that all have a lot of high frequency content, and you have to use EQ to sculpt out room for everything to exist in the same space at the same time, and so that you can actually hear everything clearly and concisely without removing what gives it its character. When you add warmth and presence to sounds, you help them cut through the mix without overpowering other instruments. And weirdly enough, with EQ sometimes, you can get that warmth and presence by removing frequencies instead of adding them. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and hit play on this track, and we're gonna look at the frequency analyzer built into this EQ to help us see what's going on in the mix. All right, so as we play this track, we can see there's all these frequencies that are being played from all of our multiple tracks being combined together. And as we were discussing earlier, we can use an EQ to filter out frequencies. So if I'm taking out all the low end here, bring it back. We can also filter out all the high end frequencies. Now we're just hearing the low end. And then we can also boost and cut at specific frequency areas on our track. We can also narrow or widen each cut and boost that we're doing. You'll also notice that we have all of this lingo, all this language at the top that shows us the typical language, the wording we use for problem areas in a mix. So if something's too muddy, most likely it's going to be around this frequency range that we're going to want to cut. Okay, and conversely, the bottom of this EQ has the language we use to describe something that we want to accentuate. So for example, if we wanted something to have a little bit more attitude, you could go ahead and boost this area, and you can see the frequencies go up, and we're using the language instead of hyper-focusing on the frequencies. As we continue through this series, you'll intuitively and naturally start to associate these words with specific frequency areas, which is a lot more useful when you're communicating to an artist, when you're communicating to a band member, when you're communicating to a client. It's much more useful to communicate with this language as opposed to let's boost 1K on the snare or let's cut 300 hertz on the bass. And with this example in this track, I'll play it again. We have an EQ plugin on the whole mix. Okay, so all of our tracks are being sent into this just for demonstration purposes. But if I go ahead and close out, in your software, you can throw an EQ just on your bass, just on your drums, on your melody, your synths, individually, and EQ them specifically for what you need them to do within the context of the whole mix. So this is where the power of EQ comes in, because you can throw EQ on basically every track, filter out what you don't need, and boost or cut in specific frequency areas for what you need that track to do within the context of the whole mix. It's really the Swiss Army knife of mixing tools. And a great way to conceptualize what EQ is imagine 1,000 tiny volume faders all across the frequency spectrum that control the volume of every specific frequency. Okay, and that's what EQ is doing with our boost and cuts. We're basically boosting the volume or cutting the volume of specific frequencies within the frequency range. I'm gonna throw an EQ just on our drums here and just play around with it a little bit. So as far as art goes, I would say that EQ is quite artistic because you can get very creative with your EQing, and depending how you choose to EQ a song, those decisions will completely change the feel of that track. All that to say is that there's really not one way to go about it. It very much comes down to preference and taste. As long as you follow a few simple guidelines to help create a balance within the frequency spectrum of your mix, and that's exactly what we're going to be digging into throughout this whole series. For example, if I play this drum track and play with the EQ, I can change the character of the drums just by cutting or boosting specific areas. Notice how much that changes the character of our drums. Let me bypass this without it. Right, we added a ton of thump, a ton of low end. But we could also do something like this. And have it be very bright. So as we continue to move forward through this series, we'll talk about what an equalizer is and how it actually works, because there's nothing more frustrating than using a tool that you don't understand. And we'll make sure you know exactly what all the buttons do and what the frequency ranges represent before we dive into advanced EQ strategies. Because once you have a solid foundation of understanding this tool and being able to hear the different frequencies that you're working with, everything else is a piece of cake. Then on top of that, then we'll start to understand the jargon and the vocabulary that's used when we EQ audio, with specific tips for each frequency range and instrument. So we'll be talking about bass, drums, guitars, synths, vocals, background vocals, extra instruments, all sorts of cool stuff, as well as narrowing in and focusing on each frequency range in the frequency spectrum. So the low end, the low mids, the mid range, the high mids, and the super high end, and some of the best practices for those. One super important thing to keep in mind throughout this whole series is that EQ is present in every part of the mixing process, and you use it every step along the way. So like I mentioned, you throw EQ on pretty much every track: your snare top, your snare bottom, your overheads, your bass track, your bass synth, your guitars, your synth tracks, your vocal, your background vocal layers, any special effects will all have their own EQ plugin on them. However, also if we think about tracking vocals with a microphone, if we think about miking up an acoustic guitar or the tone coming out of a guitar amp or creating a synth patch, all of those situations use EQ, but in a different context. It might not look like an EQ plugin like this in all of those examples. However, within all of those examples, we're doing things that are influencing the frequency spectrum. With a microphone, it has its own frequency response, and there's the mic placement. With a guitar, there's the actual instrument. With a guitar amp, there's how you're sculpting the tone and your signal chain. With a synth, you're going to be using filters and oscillators and all sorts of different things, which will all use the same principles as EQ. If you want to follow along with the same EQ that we'll be using throughout this whole series and really start integrating and mastering the language and hearing the frequency spectrum, definitely check out the description below to learn more about the Audio Issues EQ. Think of your EQ as your trusty lightsaber on your journey as a mixing engineer. You might pick up more tips, tricks, and techniques of the Force along the way, but your lightsaber will always be there by your side. So if you're ready to begin your journey to master the EQ, to get your mixes to pop through the speakers and sound radio ready, to master that lightsaber, definitely click the next video in the series, and I'll see you there.